somewhere in the foothills of the Andes, where the air cuts into your lungs with cold and the earth smells of damp clay and forgotten gods, about 7,500 years ago, in what is now Bolivia or Peru. A woman from the Nyanchok culture, one of the oldest farming peoples of the Andes, who lived thousands of years before the Inca, and even before the continent's first great civilizations, digs into the earth with her bare hands. She pulls out a pod, cracks the shell, tastes you raw, just to find out, edible or not, the taste is grassy, buttery, unlike anything she knows. Her stomach stays quiet, no poison, just a fullness that comes fast and lingers, just dirty fingers and a woman who's just made one of the most important discoveries of her millennium. But wait, before we move forward in time, we need to rewind. Much, much further back, because that woman from the Nyanchok Valley only met the finished version of you, the final product. And it didn't start 7,000 years ago, or even 100,000. It started 58 million years ago. The dinosaurs were already gone by then. Earth was just beginning to recover from the catastrophe that had wiped out nearly everything, big and loud, and in that post-apocalyptic silence, small plants, the ancestors of the entire legume family, which you'd eventually join, were living through their own, much quieter drama. A glitch happened in their genome, or rather, an explosion, a complete doubling of all their genetic material, copy stacked on copy, set stacked on set. For a plant, that's not a mistake. That's a jackpot. A doubled genome means doubled material to experiment with. Spare copies of genes you can break, alter, test out for new jobs without risking the original. This was the moment. Nature handed the legume family a spare parts kit and said, "Figure out what to do with it. You've got millions of years." You, of course, didn't exist yet. You were just a possibility, tucked away in the surplus chromosomes of some nameless grassy plant that had no idea what career it had just set itself up for. Then another 50-some million years passed, and somewhere inside that doubled genetic wealth, two separate wild species matured, Arachis duranensis and Arachis ipaensis. About 2 to 3 million years ago, their paths split for good. Duranensis settled in the northwest of what's now Argentina and nearby parts of Bolivia. Dry, rocky foothills where the plant crept low along the ground, barely noticeable, with small leaves and modest yellow flowers hiding among the grass as if embarrassed by their own existence. Ipaensis picked a far narrower home, a tiny patch of central Bolivia in the valley of the Itachupe River, and nowhere else on the planet. A narrow range, a narrow fate. Both species were low-growing, delicate, with tiny, almost dwarfish pods. Nothing like the hearty, meaty body you have today. Just two modest, grassy corners of South America, separated by hundreds of miles of mountains and rivers, each with no idea the other existed. And then, about 10,000 years ago, a new chapter in your story begins. The ancient peoples of South America, without realizing it, became matchmakers. Migrating along the mountain valleys, they apparently carried Duranensis seeds with them. Maybe as food, maybe by accident, stuck to the soles of their feet or tucked in their packs, and dropped them right into Ipaensis territory, into that same tiny Itachupe River valley, which had never had a single neighbor. Two wild, modest species that had never crossed paths ended up on the same patch of ground. Then the ones nobody invited and nobody paid took over. Bees, ordinary wild pollinators, flying from flower to flower with no idea of geography or genetics, just doing their dull daily job, and accidentally carrying pollen from one species onto the stigma of the other. And just like that, with no thunder and no lightning, one of the most important botanical love affairs in the continent's history happened as a byproduct of a bee's routine workday. You appeared, tetraploid, genetically locked in, not quite like either parent, and forever tied to the valleys of Bolivia, where it all began. Now a bit of bad news for a straight timeline. That woman from the Yanchok Valley we started with, she wasn't the first. Long before her, back when the hybrid had just come into being, wild Arachis species were already ending up in human hands on the Peruvian coast. Starch grains and microscopic residues on stone tools found there date back roughly 10,000 years, meaning people were tasting your wild ancestors almost immediately after they appeared, long before any domestication happened. But you, specifically, recognizable, cultivated, unmistakably Arachis hypogaea. That's confirmed much later, Quebrada, Tierra Blanca, Peru, about 5,000 years ago. So the wild version of you got tasted right away, but for humanity to accept you as a fully domesticated member of the family took another 5,000 years of hesitation. Then a few more thousand years passed, and you weren't sitting quietly in the Bolivian valleys anymore. You were on the move. Slowly at first, from camp to camp, through Andean mountain passes. Then faster, along the coast, through the jungle, through deserts. And before a single European had even heard the word America, you'd already conquered the entire continent, from Patagonia to Mexico. Century after century, Andean civilizations picked out the best pods, the hardiest, the most productive, and, without ever meaning to, spent thousands of years running your own selective breeding program. Nobody wrote it down in a lab notebook. Someone just kept saving the best seeds for next season. That's what evolution looks like when it's driven by hunger and taste instead of nature. And here's an unexpected twist. For the Inca and the Aztec, you weren't just food. You were ground into a thick paste and offered to the gods. Yes, long before anyone invented peanut butter for kids' school lunches, you were a ritual delicacy, a gift to the heavens. Picture it. The same stuff now spread on toast between classes was once placed on an altar. Then, in 1502, on Hispaniola, a man named Bartolomé de las Casas showed up. The local Caribbean peoples showed him you, calling you by a short, almost affectionate word, money. They ate you happily and considered you good for them. The Spanish looked at you, shrugged, and decided, food for the poor. Isn't that ironic? A divine gift to one people turns out to be beneath the table for another, and the only difference between those two judgments is a few weeks at sea and the skin color of the people eating you. Then Spain got what it actually wanted, not you, but Brazil. Around 1500, the Portuguese set foot on the new continent, and along with gold, timber, and spices, they loaded you onto the ship too. No ceremony, just one more cargo item among 100 others, across the Atlantic, for months, in holds that smelled of salt, rot, and a long journey. And now you're in Europe. But here, a short dramatic pause because history's throwing in another irony. Europe barely noticed you. They already had nuts, oils, familiar fats. You didn't get the starring role. You got the role of a passenger in transit. Because from there, from Spanish and Portuguese ports, you kept moving. In the early 17th century, the galleons running between Mexico and the Philippines, the legendary Manila galleon route, carried you across the Pacific. The Philippines, Indonesia, the coast of China. Asia welcomed you far more warmly than Europe did. Very quickly you found your way into local dishes, sauces, street food, as naturally as if you'd always lived there. Now, the hardest part of this chapter. No room for irony here, just cold facts. The Portuguese slave trade, the same one that devastated West Africa for profit, used you as a cheap, calorie-dense, long-lasting food source for the Middle Passage, the horrific sea route that carried millions of people across the Atlantic as property. Captains loaded their holds with you, not out of respect for your value, but out of cold calculation. You're cheap, you're filling, you keep. And here's the chilling part. The leftover provisions, the scattered seeds, took root on Caribbean and American plantations. You literally sprouted in the wake of one of the darkest crimes in human history. Can a plant be called innocent if its spread is forever tangled up with the tragedy of millions? It's a rhetorical question. There's no answer, just a fact. Wherever the slave trade went, you went too, silent, uninvolved, but forever woven into that history. Then came the Civil War. Civil. Both sides, North and South, fed you to their soldiers. Because you're cheap, filling, keep well, and don't need special conditions. In the mud, blood, and hunger of field camps, you were one of the few stable things around, and people still look down on you. Because in the minds of white farmers, middle class and up, you stayed branded. Poor people's food, slave food, hog feed. None of the wealthy planters were in a hurry to plant you as a cash crop. Too low status, too black a reputation for a crop that had just fed an entire army. Short pause, because this is where history sets up one of its biggest plot twists. Around 1900, something showed up that changed the rules of the game: mechanical harvesters and shellers. Suddenly, what had taken centuries to do by hand, slowly and expensively, started happening fast and cheap. Production costs dropped overnight. Then just 3 years later, in 1903, a man whose name would forever be tied to your story stepped in. Agricultural chemist George Washington Carver, the son of a formerly enslaved woman working at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. He didn't see poor people's food in you. He saw a chemistry lab disguised as a snack, and the urgency didn't come from science, it came from disaster. Starting around the mid-1910s, the boll weevil ravaged the South, a beetle that methodically destroyed the cotton monoculture farmers had relied on for generations. The soil was exhausted, harvests burned out, whole families on the edge of starvation. Carver's solution: plant legumes. They restore nitrogen to depleted soil. Farmers listened and suddenly found themselves with fields full of you and no idea what to do with the surplus. That's when Carver got to his real work. He came up with over 300 uses for you: oil, soap, cosmetics, dyes, glue, even printing ink. In 1921, he stood before the U.S. Congress to convince lawmakers of your crop's economic value, and within minutes turned a skeptical committee into a captivated audience. That's how hog feed became a nationally significant commodity crop, and you went from a stain on Southern farming's reputation to its salvation. Today, you're not just a plant anymore. You're a global industry worth billions. In the United States, you're among the 12 most valuable commodity crops in the country, and at the retail level alone, Americans spend more than $2 billion a year on you and products made from you. And that number doesn't seem to be slowing down. If anything, the industry is investing heavily in harvest automation, drought-resistant varieties, and even eco-friendly packaging, as if bracing to feed the planet even longer than it already has. Now, a quick geography lesson, because your empire, it turns out, has spread across nearly every continent except Antarctica. The top producer today is China, growing more than 20 million tons a year. India holds second place, with Nigeria and the United States splitting third and fourth, and Sudan and Argentina rounding out the top producers. Together, China, India, and Nigeria account for more than half of the world's total production. So who's buying the most? Here's the paradox. The European Union is one of the biggest importers, despite barely growing you at all. The climate's just too cold. The Netherlands, Germany, and several other EU countries buy you up heavily for processing and re-export as finished products. In other words, Europe is that dinner guest who cooks nothing themselves, but somehow serves the dish as if it were their own. So how's that for a career? From a scared little hybrid sprout in the Andean valleys to a commodity weighed by the millions of tons shipped across oceans and hit with tariffs as seriously as oil or grain. All right, you've made it through the history. All of it, from the Andean hybrid to customs paperwork. But hold on a second, because so far you've just been a timeline: dates, ships, wars, names of people who alternately looked down on you or worshipped you. You've been the object of other people's decisions. What if we set the calendar aside and actually look at you, not where you've been, but what you are?
Because under that cracked shell, there's a lot more than meets the eye. Let's start with the insult you carry in your own name. Because you're not a nut, you never were. You're an annual herbaceous plant in the legume family, related to peas and beans, and what everyone calls a shell is really just the wall of the pod. Technically, a pericarp in botanical terms. Which means your whole life you've been mislabeled on every package in every supermarket on Earth. How's that for fame? Becoming one of the most famous nuts on the planet while not actually being one at all. And here's the strangest part. Your flower blooms above ground, like any normal plant. But after pollination, something happens that no one else does. The ovary doesn't stay up top. It grows into a special shoot called a peg, and that peg literally pushes itself down into the soil. Only there, in the dark, without a single ray of sunlight, does the pod you love to crack open actually form. And, burying yourself once isn't enough. You bloom continuously. New shoot, new flower, new peg, over and over, all season long, like an assembly line that never takes a day off. But patience here isn't a suggestion. It's a requirement. From the moment the peg goes into the ground to a finished pod takes at least 60 to 70 days, and the whole plant needs about 5 months of warmth and a solid amount of rain. And even then, a farmer doesn't just eyeball you from the outside. They crack the pod open and look inside, because the inner wall of the shell, gradually darkening from white to almost black, honestly tells them whether you're ready or not. All right, shape covered. Now let's look inside, where you're actually dangerous. In a good way, because for every 3.5 ounces of you, there's about 0.9 ounces of protein, more than most of the nuts you're constantly confused with. And it's not some second-rate, incomplete protein either. You contain all 9 essential amino acids, which puts you in the rare club of complete plant proteins. A club plants don't often get into. Meanwhile, your carb content is tiny. Somewhere around 13 to 16% of your mass, and more than 80% of your fats are unsaturated, the good kind. In other words, you behave more responsibly on a plate than half of what people eat for breakfast. But don't sigh with relief just yet. Because those same proteins that make you valuable, arakin and canarakin, turn you into public enemy number 1 for some people. Their bodies just decide you're dangerous and declare war on you. Sometimes it's a rash, sometimes it's something that can cost a life. And here's the interesting part. In the US, about 2 people in 100 are allergic to you. In India, where people eat you daily and in much larger amounts, only about 3 children in 10,000 are affected. One last thing, how you're prepared barely changes your nutritional value. Roasted, raw, boiled, you stay roughly the same protein package. Storage conditions, though, are a different story. Warm, damp environments turn you into the perfect home for Aspergillus flavus mold, which produces aflatoxin, a toxin that, in high doses, can seriously damage the liver. So you're simultaneously an almost perfect food and a potential hazard, depending entirely on how carefully you're handled.
Now picture a different scene. Right now, somewhere in Georgia, a kid rips open a peanut bar wrapper before gym class without even glancing at what they're eating. 5 minutes later, the wrapper's in the trash. Same plant, same gesture of fingers digging in. Except instead of damp Andean clay, it's cellophane and a barcode. The woman from the Nyanchak Valley risked her health tasting you, just to understand her world. This kid has no idea they're holding 7,500 years of history in their hand. So how's that for a legacy? From a sacred discovery to a trash can in a matter of seconds. If this story just shook up your idea of the ordinary peanut, even a little, hit like and subscribe. Next time we'll dig up something just as unexpected.